the Assad regime was in a bad shape in 2014-15. Then the Russian support, the Iranian support allowed Assad to push back and seize many of the areas which were under the rebels, mostly Islamist militias. And Idlib, as you just mentioned, is basically the largest enclave of Islamist militias in Syria facing the Assad regime. That will bring us to 2016, 2017, and all the way to our time right now. Idlib was protected basically by the Turkish government, Turkish authorities. Now let's ask the question, what was the policy of the Turkish government, of the AKP government in Ankara? Their policy as of 15, 16, 17 was to carve up in northern Syria a significant area which has a majority of Arab Sunnis with Islamist militias and consider that zone under Turkish influence. The initial goal of Turkey, of the Erdogan government, was to support the Islamist opposition to Assad to bring down that government, to bring down that regime. It did not happen. From the moment the Russians and the Iranians heavily involved themselves in Western Syria, it was technically impossible for the pro-Turkish militias, or mostly the Ikhwan militias, of toppling Assad. That's the equation. Now, the US position, meanwhile, the US position till about the Trump administration was that because of the negotiations over the Iran deal, 2014, and then the Iran deal 15 and 16, no massive intervention by the US that would upset the Iran regime, upset in the sense that would crumble that deal. So the US, as of 15, 16, was involved in the northeastern part of Syria where the Kurds are, with the local organization, the YPG, or Syria Democratic Front. That would leave us with the part of the Trump administration. That's 2017 and 2018. What did really change in Idlib and around Idlib? Number one, the Trump administration reinforced its presence, the US presence, military presence, in the northeast where the Kurdish forces are. Number two, more importantly, it pushed very strongly to eliminate ISIS from eastern Syria. I mean, we could talk about it probably for an hour, but without the push by the Trump administration and support from Congress, of course, ISIS would have still been in Syria or in central Syria. So they have been pushed all the way to the borders. But beyond that, the real strategic goal of the presence of the US, and that's mostly 2018, in addition to eliminate ISIS completely, is to interdict an advance of pro-Iranian militias, including Assad militias and Hezbollah, from western Syria into the borders with Iraq. Why? And I'll come back to Idlib for a 1 minute here. It's because the Iranian strategy is to connect Iran through Iraq, we know that, and from Iraq into the borders with Syria, all the way to Damascus, Hezbollah, and Lebanon. The most crucial area is the eastern part of Syria where we are right now, which leads me to conclude that at this point in time, the US strategically, if we read it on the map, has no engagement in western Syria where Idlib is. We are not present around Idlib. So the only exception that the administration made, and that was supported by Congress, is that if Assad uses chemical weapons, then we will react. And the administration did it twice so far. So at this point in time, Idlib has become an area comprised between Iran, Russia, Assad, Hezbollah group, and on the other hand, you have Turkey and the Islamist militias that are Ikhwan, if we can say it. So the Assad regime with his allies decided a few months ago that they want to push these militias out and seize the area. The Turks had, unfortunately for them of course, entered a zone of tension with the Trump administration because of political matters, including the pastor who is now still jailed in Turkey. So there was no possibility for the US to side with the Turks against the coalition led by the Iranians. So that will bring me to the current situation. What the Russians were able to do, and with them the Iranians, is to convince the Turks to have a special agreement on Idlib. And the special agreement, I compared it to an example from history, much bigger example, the Brest-Litovsk agreement between Germany and Russia towards the end of World War I, which is that they will create a buffer zone between themselves. Poland will be somewhat divided, so the Baltics would be. Obviously, this is much larger territory, but that is what I feel right now is the case between the Russian-led coalition and the Turks. They're going to neutralize Idlib. The Iranians and the Russians asked President Erdogan to remove the most critical elements, that would be al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and the Turks have asked that they can maintain the Muslim Brotherhood type militias. That is so far what has been happening in Idlib, if we use a national security narrative. The rest, of course, is a lot of diplomatic ballet, political negotiations, but on the ground, reality is that Idlib is surrounded by the Iranian axis. They're not going to move in right now. And on the other hand, the Turks have promised that they will pacify, quote unquote, Idlib. And I conclude with this. The concern is when you have two powers like Turkey and Russia negotiating some sort of ceasefire or agreement in Idlib, it means that the two forces need that ceasefire to go do something else somewhere else. So in my sense, I think that the Iran axis in this case with Hezbollah and Assad and Russia, they really want to go to East Syria where we are. They really want to try to make sure that the corridor between Iran and Syria and Lebanon is open. They came close to Al-Tanf last week, I guess, or 2 weeks ago, and the US is very determined not to allow them to do so. So a ceasefire in Idlib means that the forces of the Axis are going to come closer to our areas and the Kurdish areas. Turkey, at the same time, obviously, their first enemy is the YPG, the Kurdish militias, which we are protecting. And that's one of the crises that we have with Turkey. Definitely, if they have an agreement on Idlib, they could have their allies pushing against the Kurds. So I conclude by saying a ceasefire in Idlib means that two fires are going to come against our allies and potentially against our forces in eastern Syria. And I will conclude here. I'll be more than happy to take any question that you have. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity.